All right. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, depending on where you are joining us from. So this is yet another fantastic meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, and I am a co-organizer of this platform along with Brad Smith, who is at Vanderbilt. So the OPSC began way back in 2015, quite a long run at this point. And this started as an extension of the annual meeting of the Peace Science broader conference. To bring together people from a wider audience and to get greater engagement on the fantastic work that peace science scholars are doing in between the conference times. So you can follow us on Twitter or X if you search for the Online Peace Science Colloquium. We are also present on the Peace Science website. So today we have a really fantastic paper, and it is titled "For the Sake of Peace, Pipe Down, Examining the Conflict Risks of Continued Investments in Oil and Gas." This is coming to us from Yaron Weissberg, who is at ETH Zurich. And today we have a fantastic discussant, Nina von Uexkull, from University of Constance, and we also give thanks to Darren Christensen, who was at UCLA, who has provided comments to the author but was not able to join us during this call. So just a little bit of basics of how this will go. We will have attendees you can leave comments or questions in the chat. We actually encourage you to do this so that the author can go back and see these comments at a later date. I will try and keep track of these as well so that I can help structure the conversation. But we'll have about a 15-minute presentation from Yaron, and then we'll move on to Nina's comments, followed, of course, by anything coming from the audience. So without further ado, I'll turn it over. Yaron, I will also drop in the chat a 2-minute warning for you, but you have about 15 minutes. You can take a little bit longer if you need to. There's no problem, but go ahead.
All right, let me just share my screen. Perfect. Can you see it? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me and for the discussions, for taking your time. I'm so happy that this worked out. So thank you so much. Today I'm presenting a paper or a chapter of my dissertation, which focuses on climate mitigation and conflict. So this is the overall topic of my dissertation. And in this paper specifically, I look at the supply side of these the discussions involved. So just a brief overview of the presentation I'm going to give today. I'm briefly going to talk about the motivation behind this particular piece, briefly talk about the literature and why this is an important addition to the literature. I will present my argument, which kind of focuses on the difference between oil fields and pipelines and how I think they have lead to different conflict outcomes. I will talk about the empirical strategy and very briefly about my data project, which is a major part of my dissertation, and then talk about the results and where I stand with this paper at the moment. So like I said, I focus on climate mitigation and what this means for conflict with a specific focus on natural resources. And so in order to mitigate climate change, we need to conduct many changes in the resource area. So we need to get away from oil and gas and also increase our demand for specific minerals that we need for clean energy technologies. And so what I do in this paper, I focus on oil and gas supply. So there's been increasing criticism of new oil and gas projects because of the climate crisis. And there's actually a new publication out there that shows that when we just look at the climate impacts, not all oil and gas sources have kind of the same negative impact on the climate. And I was motivated by this to kind of differentiate between different sources of oil and gas, but not necessarily for climate outcomes, but for conflict outcomes. And this paper is that the goal with this paper is to address this. So I want to see if stopping new oil and gas supplies from coming online don't just help the environment, but could also mitigate conflict risk And if that is in fact the case, also understand where do these risks come from specifically, so that we can focus on these first if we have conflict in mind. So in doing so, I can build on a very big literature that has explored the oil conflict nexus. And I won't go through the entire literature here because that would take way too long. Just very briefly, there are kind of two different themes in the literature. One is kind of this rational choice, greed-based argument that tries to argue that oil leads to conflict because individuals can loot oil, they can extort money from it, and this is why we see the conflict and the presence of oil correlate. Another literature focuses more on the grievance aspect. So they look at where the oil is extracted, how it negatively can affect local communities and thereby lead to violent mobilization. And so the most papers that examine this so far, they use data at the subnational level on oil and gas fields, and then show using different factors, so where the oil is located, on versus offshore, what is the power of the group that live in proximity to the operating fields, and in order to make the case for these various arguments. And often they use either price shocks or oil and gas discoveries. Now, to address my research question, to figure out which investments are the dangerous ones, and if they in fact lead to conflict, these findings are very helpful, but one thing that is missing is data on oil and gas production, and especially time series data. So I want to know when a new field comes online or on stream, does this in fact increase the risk of conflict? And so this is one thing I tried to address with this paper. Another dimension which is also missing is the importance of pipelines. I believe it's important because of two ways. So first of all, when we talk about new projects that are now coming under scrutiny, it's not just new fields, but it's a lot of pipeline projects that are being scrutinized. So just coming again from the research question, this is an interesting topic. The other thing is that it's really a crucial aspect in the oil conflict nexus as a whole. And I argue in this paper that this is mainly if we follow the rational choice or the materialistic, or sometimes also called greed-based arguments. This is where these infrastructures, where they are located, what they transport, this is where they're really important. And so this can be because of looting. So if you want to steal oil physically, you can do this through a process called bunkering. So tapping a pipeline is much easier than actually taking over an oil field. But especially for extortion purposes, so when we see attacks on fossil fuel infrastructure, this often targets pipelines. And so the picture I show here from the famous case from Colombia kind of illustrates this point. When it comes to the grievance logic, like I said, another major theme in the literature, I'm not so sure if here pipelines matter to the same extent. And so I think they can cause some mobilization, protest. I was seeing in the lower picture here. There certainly are certain elements that are connected to the grievances that are connected to fields, such as intrusion by the state, or people might be evicted. But I will argue, and that's kind of the main argument of the paper as it is now, is that if we compare these different themes, new pipeline projects can maybe lead to more opportunities to loot, to extort, etc. But when it comes to the grievance argument, one that is like that leads to major civil war onsets of violence on a much higher level, there I think pipelines do not lead to that problem or are not as dangerous. And the main argument for this is that pipelines are not fixed in place, so they can be rerouted and avoid troubling areas or areas that might be dangerous. But the main argument is that they do not follow what I believe to be one of the main drivers of conflict in oil-producing regions, and that is kind of this distributive argument, so that local leaders can argue that is their group that suffers from the negative externalities of extraction, and that they are not gaining as much from the revenues as they should. And this argument is also called local oil nationalism. And I think this applies to fields, but for pipelines, yes, you can make some money with like transit fees and certain aspects like this. But I would argue that this is not the driving issue at stake here. So that's kind of the main argument. Now, how do I test this empirically? I conduct analysis at 2 levels of analysis. So I start with a very local level analysis using the Prio grid, where I add new data that I'm producing on oil fields and pipelines. This allows me to look at conflict events, so lower level conflicts using the UCDP conflict data, as well as other data sources, but I will stick mainly to the UCDP results, and conduct two-way fixed effects regression, looking at when a pipeline becomes operational and when the field becomes operational and comparing these effects. Then in the second step, I do the same, but at the ethnic group level. So using EPR ethnic group polygons. These are on average much bigger in space. So I have fewer observations, but I can make up for this by having a much longer time period to analyze. And in both, I control for peace years and population, and also for other variables like development in certain models, which do not change the result. Most importantly is for the specific grievance argument, I specifically focus on interaction with the presence of these oil and gas infrastructures with whether the local ethnic group is politically marginalized or not. And that's kind of the main interaction that I'm interested to figure out whether grievances are really at play or not. All right. And so I have to do this very briefly, but one of the main innovations of the paper is that I build on my new data set on oil and gas projects, which I call GeoPipe, the Geographical Pipeline and Extraction data set, which is a time series data set that starts in 1945 until 2020. And you see here how it moves over time. So green are the oil pipelines, red are the gas pipelines. And you see the active oil fields when they're shown in black. And as soon as they're connected to pipelines, they are marked in yellow. And by doing this, I not only add the pipelines, but I also increase the time series data we have on oil and gas field extraction. That is one of the crucial aspects that has been missing so far. All right, and then you see how it works before I showed you for South and East Asia, and this is kind of the global picture. Where you can also differentiate between the different fuel types. Important to say here is that the quality of the data is not equal for each region. So I will exclude the regions where I'm not very happy with the quality, such as in Europe and North America. So what I do is I exclude all OECD member states, which has also been done in previous analysis. All right, so let's briefly talk about the results. So I start with the local analysis, as I said, with the Prio grid, and focus just on pipelines. Fields lead to a kind of similar story here. And surprising, I find that new pipelines actually reduce conflict risk if you just look at UCDP conflict events. I then differentiate, and you can see this in the figure on the left here. I differentiate between different global regions, and then I do find some conflict-inducing effects when looking at Latin America, but only for non-state violence. And I think that kind of makes sense with the cases that are relevant here, such as Colombia and Mexico. And also Latin America is often the special case in the oil when studying the oil conflict nexus. But this is just the introduction of new pipelines and the local effects that this might have. And then in the second step, I more closely analyze the grievance logic. So what you see here are new field and pipelines. At the top, you see at the grid level, and at the lower panel, you see at the ethnic group level. And then really zeroing in on the difference between included and excluded groups. And what I find here is that here I find the positive effect on conflict, so where new fossil fuel projects really have a conflict-inducing effect, but I only find them for fields and only if they are situated in an area where the ethnic community is politically marginalized, which is a finding that we had in previous analysis as well. And so for the grid analysis, I find this only when I look at state-based UCDP events, and at the ethnic group level, I only find it for territorial civil war, which again makes sense given that this has been the major finding in the literature so far. But most importantly, I do not find any conflict-inducing effects for pipelines, either at the grid or at the group level. So this is basically where I am at the moment. So there are more robustness tests that I need to do. But I also want to explore a bit more the differences between these two types of investments. And so I've been playing around with some ideas. So one thing is to look at certain benefits that such investments may have. So in one point, I look at development outcomes of both, and I find that pipelines have a slightly higher effect of increasing local development, but local development is measured in night lights, and that's often very much criticized. Another thing I look at is whether the state treats these regions differently by granting inclusion or local autonomy. And here I find that, yes, when you construct a pipeline through the territorial area, to the territory of an ethnic group, there is a slight increase in the chance that it will be included in the government. But the effect for fields is much larger. So fields have a much higher strategic priority, or states may simply anticipate that this might be a conflict-prone issue, which is why they react in that way. And to kind of finish, I also need to say that I don't want people to read this paper and think it's like a full-on endorsement of new pipeline projects simply because I don't find these conflict-inducing effects. I do find some peaceful effects, but these are not robust. And I do find that pipelines are in fact connected to conflict. It's just not necessarily the new projects. So if we just look at existing pipelines, then there is a strong connection. For new ones, I only find some effects for Latin America. And then I don't know if we have time to discuss this as well. So there's been a recent paper that also has looked at pipelines and found different results. And I kind of made a list of why my results differ. I think one of the main contributions of this paper is that it really has a global scope. And so I can look at different regions. I also use different data. So I use my own geopipe data. Exactly. And also I am a bit more generous in treating what is in fact a field or not. So it could also be that certain of these conflict-inducing tendencies that this paper found for pipelines could be spillovers that result from fields. All right. So to conclude, to go back to the main research question, I am able to find some evidence that stopping new fossil fuel projects can in fact limit conflict in the future. However, this would primarily go for new field developments, which are in fact being proposed. And if they cannot be stopped, a more inclusive governance should be advocated in order to minimize the risks associated with these investments. And with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yaron. That was wonderful. So I will turn it over to Nina first for comments, and then followed up by Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks for inviting me to comment on this paper. I think this data is really exciting, and it makes for many novel contributions and can speak to many questions, including resource conflict you do, but also disaggregated conflict research, conflict early warning, do we expect violence around pipelines. So I think this is really promising as a project. I can also think that's very relevant outside academia. You can thinking about not only the relevance for climate change mitigation as a discussion, but also insurance, extractive industries, understanding whether pipelines lead to conflict is obviously a relevant question. Turning to the paper, I think it does a lot. Next to new data, I really like that you try to estimate causal mechanisms, and you also have a very comprehensive set of data that you analyzed, different kinds of outcomes, different types of interaction effects. So I really look forward to discussing this. I have a few comments. I will start with the broadest one before moving on to a few more nitty-gritty on the research design and the results. So first of all, thinking about the broader debate, so you situated in the climate change mitigation debate, and I think that's relevant and that is important. If we look into this debate, we see that research shows that if we want to keep temperature globally well below 2 degrees, so meet the Paris Agreement, close to 60% of known oil and fossil methane gas reserves and 90% of coal must remain unextracted. And I think your paper speaks to that. With that said, also there is some projections from the International Energy Agency predicting that this, if we do that, this will obviously have implications for oil prices as well, for example, leading to decreasing prices, but also more volatile prices. So I think one thing that I was kind of missing in your paper and would strengthen it is, isn't it the current economic viability that is a kind of scope conditions for what you find. So I think adding that debate, that adding, if you kind of keep it in the climate change mitigation as the main framing, I think I would like to see more of these debates. So what is actually the scope condition here? Is it about the fields, or is it about the economic viability, and how will that change with climate change mitigation? And this may also have implications for how you set this up. I mean, I saw that you have fields, you have pipelines, but you don't have prices. So I was really wondering if you had done more of this, and if so, on what the outcome was. Moving on then further to more the nitty-gritty and the research design, I think one broader question I had is really where violence does happen. And I think for much of the violence you have in there, like terrorist attacks, you have this extraction logic. So it really happens where the pipelines are, it happens where the fields are, but not for all. So you have also this grievance argument in there. And I really like that you have pre-writs, and you also have the EPR larger groups. But I would like to see more of a theoretical argument for how this is set up. So both, I mean, you have in this these disaggregated conflict research, and probably you're aware of that, you have this modifiable aerial unit problem. So you have pre-grids, which is very convenient in many ways. So this is pre-gridded, but is that really the unit that we're thinking about? Is it motivated for all types of violence? And if it's not, and you have the EPR as well, how can you use that to mitigate some of these issues? So I was specifically wondering if you use the EPR to the conflict data, this ethnic group involvement link that I think would mitigate some of it, because then you know where the grievances maybe originate in the oil production area, but then the actual violence may actually takes place somewhere else for strategic reasons. So I think thinking more about that and articulating it in the paper is something that could strengthen it. Then I was also kind of moving to the identification strategy. I was thinking, I think you have really intriguing findings about this pipelines and this potential reduction here. But also, as you acknowledge, both the opening of the field and the pipeline location is not exogenous to conflict. So it will not happen if you have an ongoing conflict there. So that's not an issue you can address easily. What I was wondering, though, is do you try to do this partly by introducing a lot of fixed effects here, by introducing peace years here? I think one thing that might strengthen it is at least to show whether your opening of the opening of the extraction works out of sample. So not only working with fixed effects, but really trying to see, on new data, does it contribute? I think that would strengthen it. And then I'm also thinking you might be able to do a better job by accounting for spatial dependence in your data. You have these clustered by the fixed effects on the grid cell level, but of course grid cells are 50 by 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. They're quite small, right? So they are not independent from each other. So you could do a better job perhaps by using Conley standard errors to kind of try to account for this clustering in space. So I think this is something that potentially might strengthen how you identify these effects. And then related to that, it may potentially help to think more about what is the actual sample you're comparing this with. I think you are dropping Europe, and you're also dropping US, and maybe that is helpful to making the sample more homogeneous. But then I think you have fields, and then you have extraction, and then you have pipelines. might it be useful to just focus on countries where you have fields in the first place, given what you're actually interested in is these extraction dynamics, just to have a bit more homogeneous sample and not compare, any country to each other, but rather thinking more about. So these are the countries that have resources. Do we open or do we not? Do we construct? Do we not? So thinking more about this particular sample. I think since we have a second discussant, I will stop here, but just by saying that I think this is a very promising paper. If it's kind of published as a standalone one, and I understand it's part of a bigger book project, I would like to see maybe a bit more focused analysis on what is really interesting here. I think you can do a lot with it, and I think you're on a very promising path here. So thanks a lot for inviting me as a discussant.
Thank you, Nina. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Chelsea and to Jennifer for the invitation, and Yaron for the great research, and Nina for those comments. I want to build on some of Nina's comments as well. So a couple of things that, about the sort of the project in general. Yaron, as you know, I'm a big fan of your research, and I think the development of the pipeline data is a real advancement, and there's lots of things that you can do coming out of that. And so it's great to see you kind of moving forward with it. And the general topic of oil and conflict is, on one hand, well plowed, on the other hand, continues to raise new questions. And so it's great to see you tackling with those. Let me pick up, I guess, on Nina's point sort of towards the end about endogeneity, because I think that's the kind of the beast that you need to get to right away. And I hate to sort of zero in on the tough stuff first, but I think it's probably the most useful approach. I think the endogeneity problem, look, that it is real, and it actually limits the degree to which you can make the conclusions that you are currently making in the paper. So I think you actually have to, address it more head on and to scale back some of the conclusions you're making. And so, for instance, when we think about why does a pipeline get laid down? Well, probably the people who build the pipeline are intentionally selecting pathways that are conflict-free, right? Because they don't want the pipeline to get beat up. And so then any correlation between pipeline and peace in the future, is some combination of a selection effect and a treatment effect. And I think you should walk us through that logic very clearly in the actual paper, right? And the selection effect, I expect, is probably, large and positive. And so when you observe, a correlation of whatever correlation you observe between peace and pipeline into the future, or conflict and pipeline, you have to disentangle sort of what the pipeline is actually doing. I think at least the way I read your conclusion and your hypotheses right now is about suggests that you are in some sense testing the treatment effect of a pipeline, like having put down a pipeline, like what does that mean for conflict? And you don't want to make that claim because you'll get eaten up by reviewers who say, look, this is more selection effect than treatment effect. And not just reviewers. I mean, I think substantively, we want to really be honest about what we're finding. And so what you could say is that any negative effect that a pipeline has on conflict is, offset, potentially more than offset, by a more positive effect, a selection effect, right? So you could imagine a negative treatment effect that conflict is conflict-inducing by a pipeline, but it is dwarfed by the positive effect, which is what you find. But I guess what I'm saying is that you need to be a lot more cautious about how you interpret that correlation that you're finding. And I think it would be helpful, theoretically and as a research design perspective, just to walk us through what's the distinction here between selection effect and treatment effect. Okay, so having beat that to death, let me move to a second kind of big topic, which is, I think that in a sense, you are finding like, look, oil fields are still really bad for conflict, but pipelines, we don't see that effect. And in a sense, you're finding a null finding on pipelines. And as you well probably know, null findings are really hard to publish. The reason, and they're sort of really hard to get people to read or get interested about. And the reason is that like only when we have a strong prior that there should be a positive effect is the null effect, the null finding kind of interesting. So I think you can do one of two things with this. If you have a sort of null finding for pipelines, then there's two things that could be interesting. One would be to say, listen, when we compare like what we substantively should affect the effect of a pipeline, we need to have some sense of the magnitude of that, right? And by what I mean by that is like, what's the rebel financing effect of a pipeline? Do we expect that lots of rebels can, go in and bunker the oil and therefore generate a big monthly income and therefore, fund their insurgency? And if the sort of revenue potential of a pipeline is the same as or larger than an oil field, then you've got a really interesting story, right? Because then you could say, listen, both fields and pipelines generate a potential funding source, but we're not seeing the conflict effect for one of them as opposed to another. Okay, that would be an interesting story to my mind. That's option one. Option two would be to say, there is an existing literature that says there is an effect between pipelines and conflict, and I'm going to show you that that's wrong, right? So this is the sort of like Victor, what is it? The Mandaldo and I'm now forgetting, I'm blanking on his name, arguing that like, look, there is no oil curse. Michael Ross is incorrect, and this finding isn't true. And so you could go down that path. I think if you're going to do that, what you do in the paper right now is say, look, there's really only kind of one paper on this topic so far. It's not published yet. It's by Blair et al. That is what it is. You can't control whether the state of the literature. But I think if you're going to go that path, then you should do a lot more explaining in the paper about why your findings are different than, and maybe even superior to, Blair et al.'s, right? So right now, when I read how you've described it, I don't come away with a clear understanding of why, their data and their method produces one result, and your data and your method produces a different result. And so if you're going to go down this path, I think you need to like really compare the two and explain like, oh yeah, my data is better because it goes from 1945 onwards, and there's like a time dimension to it, or some kind of argument about what's the comparative advantage that you're bringing, and why yours is different or better in some way. Okay, just mindful of the time, I'll just say a couple other things. One is, for an IR scholar and somebody who's worked on international war coming out of oil, I can't resist sort of the question around pipelines that are internal to a country versus pipelines that cross borders. So it seems to me like that would be a really interesting subset. And substantively, we can think of examples like Sudan and South Sudan, when there is a pipeline that goes, from South Sudan into Sudan, like, does that have a conflict effect? Like, that would be an interesting set of cases to investigate, particularly because there are some sort of high-profile anecdotes that at least raise the question of whether the pipeline is related to conflict. And then maybe my last point, maybe the least important, but it just your presentation made me reflect on the sort of Latin American exception, which is this kind of ongoing mystery in the oil curse literature of why is it that Latin America seems to be different, not just in terms of oil and conflict, but also oil and democracy. Both of those seem to be different in Latin America. And if your data allowed you to shed light on that puzzle in some way, I think that's like a really fertile area, because it is something that is like within this fairly well-established literature, it is this weird oddity that like Latin America seems to look different. And so if you had a convincing answer for why Latin America is different, like that would be a significant contribution. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there, just mindful of time, but if you want me to say more, I'm happy to.
Okay,
Oh,
fantastic. Yep.
sorry, can I just say one other thing?
Yeah.
I'm currently in a room that I might get booted out of at any moment, and so forgive me if I have to suddenly like leave and or switch to my phone or whatever. So apologies for that.
Understood. Thank you for the comments. Okay, let's see. So Yaron, if there's anything that you'd like to on to or engage further with, you're welcome to. And in the meantime, I'll also make a call to anyone in the audience if you'd like to type something into the chat, or if you want to just notify me that you have a question, we can follow up that way.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all this feedback. This is extremely helpful. Honestly, I will comment on a few if that's okay, but I would love just to collect as much as possible, because that's really helpful to me. About the for Nina's oil price comment, this is this is also in the paper that I'm kind of speaking to, the Blair et al. Paper. They do this. It's very common in the literature, and I do this too, just in a different paper. This is a very interesting dynamic. I just don't think so. My problem is that when I present this paper, I always get the feedback that it's doing too much, and so I have been cutting it down to really only focus on the new investments. So that's kind of the way I decided to trim this to the scale that it is now. I think the prices do really matter, especially on pipelines, the location of pipelines as well. And that's also a finding that I have at the moment. It's just that's kind of, for me, kind of a little bit of a different discussion. And so I think it really fits well into the, people don't no longer like the term greed, because it's not as precise, but like these for these materialistic arguments, and there are relatively new publications out there that do exactly this. They use the price shocks and say, oh, when prices go up, you can enrich more, and then you attack more, a logic that I myself don't believe, but that's something else. Here, I don't know how it would help me in this case here. I can see that maybe in like high price periods, there is a higher interest to invest in these projects. That could be one thing. I haven't taken this on board, so I could maybe explore this dimension. And the other points are very well taken. Not just the endogeneity issue, but also the spatial dependence issue. I need to address it. I've been testing out different ways to cluster the standard errors, and in those cases, just looking at different kind of bigger units, and then the results stayed the same. But that's all I've done on that in that area so far. And regarding for Jeff, like the two strategies you outlined, I think are very good. I think I would probably go for the second one, because then I could really target this one paper that I can connect to. But you're right in the sense that for instance, they use ACLED data, which I do not. And so if I would do that, I would really have to redo the analysis with this data to see if then the results are still different. The main issue there is that they only focus on Africa. And so one of the things that I love to highlight is that with UCDP, I can have a much broader scope. Of course, I can still do both, of course, but that's just something I need to keep in mind. But I've been struggling a bit with the thing that I have to work the most on with this paper, I think, is just to kind of, that it's a bit more focused. I think it's a bit easier for the reader. And then I'm still struggling a bit where I can put in the comparison. So in the discussion, I put it at the end, but I would then probably have to start with this discussion a bit earlier. Oh, and the cross-border, this is a comment that I get often. I think this is also because this is what when people look at oil conflicts in the news, for instance, these are the conflicts that make it the most. I definitely can use the data for this. I just haven't done so. But it's something that I definitely need to think about. Yeah, so thank you so much. I would love to collect some more if that's possible.
So as we're waiting on others to make some comments, I have some half-baked thoughts. These are kind of coming together. So the first, I don't think this will help with your endogeneity issue, but I was wondering a little bit about yeah, so sorry. But I was wondering a bit about it's when pipelines are state-owned versus financed by, you know, multinational corporations, and kind of if there's any variation you could almost exploit in their placement in relation to this. And I'm thinking about, you know, states having, like, not always, but possibly having more local knowledge of security risks. Obviously, they're consulting with MNCs as well. Just like I said, I don't think it helps with, oh, sometimes they're placed, you know, with the intention of avoiding, or with the intention of altering conflict. But that might be something, maybe it's another paper, I don't know. It might be something interesting as far as their placement and their financing that you could exploit in the future. And then a bit about the, you know, Nina, I think, had some fantastic comments about the spatial dynamics of conflict here. But you know, since you mentioned the Colombian case and then the whole Latin American puzzle, right? You know, I'm thinking that when the ELN was, you know, the tactics of sort of attacking pipelines versus siphoning from pipelines produced very different spatial effects with violence. So you know, even if you're siphoning from a pipeline, rarely was the violence committed at that pipeline, right? But then there were times where these were either attempts to siphon, right, that went wrong, that led to violence, or intentional, you know, destruction of the pipeline itself. So I wonder if you can, this would not be feasible with the UCDP data, but even if you can dig into some cases about what does the actual violence related to the pipeline itself, this might help explain the null that you're getting versus other authors. Again, not, you know, that might be unique to Latin America, it might be unique to Colombia, but I could imagine that you might see some different effects, that you could perhaps get some interesting explanations for that variation. And then finally, another, you know, just with the inclusion of Mexico, if you're gonna make, I think, these sort of, I know we're hesitating to use green grievous, right, as kind of those like throwback terms, but I think if you're gonna include criminal organizations in Mexico doing the majority of violence around pipelines, and really being kind of the forefront of this pipeline-based violence in some ways, right? Like, rebels are learning from what the criminal organizations have done. I think you might want to engage a bit more about the assumptions you're making about different actors, and see if you can, again, find some way to be more straightforward about that in the data, because it may help explain where you have findings and where you don't. If you weren't engaging with this, like, grievance and or greed, I would say, you know, don't worry about that. But I think if you're going to make the step, maybe lean into it a bit more. Okay, back to Jeff. I see a hand.
Awesome. I'm just taking myself off mute. Just one other thought about the sort of the null effect that Chelsea's. I just wanted to build on this. I mean, your reaction to my question about, like, oh, well, people always ask me about the, you know, the international pipelines. I mean, one thing to do would be to say, you know, just as an analysis step, like, look at all of the pipeline cases and all of the conflicts, right? And presumably you've got a very long list of, like, non-conflicts and a short list of conflicts associated with pipelines that are, like, geographically coterminous. And so go and look at, you know, what's the subset of cases? What are we looking at of, like, what are the conflicts? And is there something about them that, you know, are these just, like, very rare events that happen sort of idiosyncratically, or is there something, like, kind of special about them that when you, like, sit down and look at them descriptively, like, a variable jumps out, like, oh, these are all related to cross-national pipelines? interesting. Maybe I should run that analysis. Or, oh, these are all like, they're only happening in East Africa. Interesting. What's going on there? You know, and dig into this a little bit, because if you could then do some explaining of the variation, like within case, you know, sort of within pipeline intra-variation, that might help your null hypothesis problem, right? In the sense of, you'd say like, look, mostly the effect actually doesn't seem to be, you know, big correlation between pipelines and conflict. But, you know, there's this handful of conditions under which, you know, we seem to get a lot of conflict. And so then you wouldn't just be trying to show a null effect, you'd be showing, you know, some negative cases and some positive cases and explaining why. And I think I'm going to have to go in about 3 minutes. Apologies.
Quite all right. Okay. I'm not seeing further questions at the moment. Nina, did you have, I know you said there were maybe a few smaller comments. Not to put you on the spot, if there's anything that you wanted to add, you're welcome.
Maybe, yeah, I can follow up on two. One is the question of the null finding, and also I think the reflections on how to sell it and how to sell the strategy. And I think I fully agree with Jeff here. But I also think that's very interesting that you don't have a full null finding. I mean, you have these findings about this terrorist attacks, for example, during ongoing conflict. So it's not it is quite interesting to see how this opening from effect is distinct from the conflict dynamics effect. So I think, given that, I also maybe on your my reflection was also that you do quite a lot in this paper. So I think in focusing on the pipeline is probably the most interesting one. So I probably would encourage you to still build more on this pipeline findings and exploit it more, rather than trying to do further things on the onset one for the oil fields, where I think we have quite some solid findings, and where I think the new data you bring in really makes for interesting findings on the pipeline specifically. And I think what the other findings replicate some of the findings that I have at least seen in other papers too. And then maybe a minor point on the peace years. I was wondering, you don't include decay or other more flexible forms of peace years here, as far as I could see. So I just wanted to hear your reflection on how you operationalize that.
How I operationalize the peace years in general, or?
Yeah, so I think you just had a peace year in there, and I was just wondering, because I was just wondering if you, I mean, in many other works you see a peace year squares, and you have to try it. You have different ways of kind of modeling a bit more, or a decay function, something that is a bit more trying to really get at this effect that is strongest at the beginning, and doing that in a different way. But I was just curious to hear if this is just peace years, just linearly, or if you've done something more with it, and if you haven't, then maybe this could also refine a little bit of the analysis.
No, absolutely. I mean, so far it's just linear, so I haven't added these terms, but that's definitely something that I have to add. And it's very useful, the comment with the where my main focus should lie, because that's the thing I always struggle with. And you're right, it's not, my field finding is basically a replication of, or a validation of, what is already out there. And it's just I highlight this to kind of show that in these discussion about the supply side, this is a relevant finding that people should look at. But you're right, at the moment it is probably takes too much like the center stage of the paper, even though it's not. And the main argument there is that the main story with oil fields doesn't apply to pipelines, but it's not the field finding that is like revolutionary here. Yes, no, that's very useful. With the what did I want to say? Ownership, I haven't looked at this. I'm still puzzled a bit if that would make a difference. I have some data on it, but I would basically have to go through all the pipelines again, which I can do. It's just a bit of a matter of time. But it is true, like the endogeneity issue. I think I do mention it in the paper, but maybe not as prominently as I should. It is true that these people definitely take into consideration where to build these infrastructures, because they're so expensive and you really don't want them to be damaged in any way. The argument that I thought would fly is basically that I just want to look at the actual implementation of these fossil fuel projects, because I kind of would expect that future ones would do the same. So they would also try to avoid these areas, and so you kind of have a similar logic going there. But of course, it's not exogenous, and I completely agree with that. And I have to think a bit more about how I could possibly address that issue. And then there is the one I forgot to mention in the beginning, the spatial component. So it is really true that, I mean, when pipelines are attacked, they are attacked where the pipeline is. And I can show this with the data, and that's nice. But when people loot oil, or even if where the rebels are active, if they have attacked the pipeline, that doesn't necessarily need to be at the same space. And so I tried to, because of this logic, I tried to justify using the Prio grid, because it's much bigger than the grids people these days use. It's quite large. And so I tried, that gives me some distance from where the pipeline actually is. They can't be too far away, otherwise they can't hit it or loot it. And I thought that's kind of a good compromise. But then again, I can try to like replicate the results using smaller and bigger grids and see if that has makes a change. For the ethnic groups there, it's really why I think this unit is so useful there is because it's not necessarily where the fields exactly are, where the violence occurs. These are often well protected by the government or by the firms that are in charge there. But it's, like I said, this distributive